Right. It's a nice looking venue. It's you're in Spain, right?
Yeah, this is my kitchen.
I like it. It looks rustic.
Yeah, it's an old stone house kind of in the middle of nowhere. I've just my car broke down couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to try living here without a car and rely on the kindness of neighbours and that kind of thing when I need to run
Mm.
it down. And see, I mean, it seems I use it like once a week. It seems ridiculous to have all that rubber and glass and metal and whatever, you know what I mean, just sitting there most of the time when I hardly use it. So I'm going to try. I'm going to try. If it's intolerable, then I'll get another car, but I'm going to see how it goes.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, obviously, my I guess not obviously, but my mind leaps as you say. All that rubber and glass and steel and aluminum and gasoline just sort of sitting there, slowly oxidizing. And my mind turns to that sort of the Elon Musk image of the future, where nobody ever has that anymore, and we have some what's it called, transportation as a service.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having this cool in my mind kind of leap back and forth between an earlier day where perhaps you would have a driver show up with a coach or a wagon. Only the very rare aristocrat would own their own coach and wagon. It'd be possible to maybe have a local farmer who has one, and that individual could bring and you could borrow that when you needed it. And then, of course, to pop forward into a circumstance where I imagine that where you are is what makes something like Uber unreasonable, but an appropriately managed transportation as a service could totally load balance the actual utility and need of medium distance, medium velocity transportation on demand, right? You would just say on Tuesday at noon, I'm going to need to have access to a vehicle to go into town. Yeah. And that's all I need.
Yep, that's right. And I mean, you could get, I did a little bit of research on this a while ago, actually. I know some numbers. There are 32 million vehicles registered in the UK. And at any given moment in time, between 80 and 99.9% of them are not being used, you know. And so not only is all of that wasted resources, but they're sitting there parked on the side of the road, blocking potential access for traffic. So you can get all those cars off the road, double the road width effectively immediately, right? It's the access versus ownership thing. But this is actually one of the things I want to talk to you about today. How do you get over these mindsets which are so deeply ingrained?
Right.
Owning a car. So I'd like to get onto that a little bit later. But yeah, thank you really very much for making the time again to talk to me. I really appreciate it. And since I last spoke to you, I've actually discovered that Game B is not just. I thought it was like a narrative framework that you had created in order to, explain the precipice that we were approaching and the profound type of change that was necessary in the way we go about things in order to avert that. But actually, it's much more than that, right? It's actually sort of a movement and a project. And so I wonder if you could just briefly outline the history of it, how it came about, what was the impetus for getting it started, who was involved, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. So let's see. Well, it's what I'd like to do first is actually, and this is a bit of a quibble, but I like it. I think it's a useful quibble, to make a distinction between the concept known as movement and the concept that I'm going to introduce. I've introduced elsewhere, and you may already be familiar with it, of scenius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen your video on scenius. Yeah.
So Game B is a scenius, not a movement. And I would say that, in fact, by proposition, every movement is, in fact, what happens when you attempt to formalize and market a scenius. Okay. At the moment where a scenius becomes captured into something that is not it, but is a simulation of it that can be sold at a profit, then it's a movement. And I think this explains a lot about how and why the things that have been known as movements in the past have done what they've done, but have also failed to do, almost universally, what they most fully intended.
Yeah. Yeah.
So consciously, it would be a sad thing if Game B were to become a movement, which of course it could be captured at any moment, but it is endeavoring to be aware of the possibility of that and to maintain its integrity as a scenius. So that already begins to answer the question. So this was very much an exercise of discovery. There was a more or less the way this began. Let me see if I can a couple of different threads that are quite interesting. So maybe I'll just identify 3. I'm sure there's many, but I'll do 3 that seem useful. One is around 2007. I was introduced to and read a book called Damon by Daniel Suarez, which is a sort of science fiction, near future techno thriller story about a computer gaming genius who dies and injects a semi-autonomous, autopoetic computer game, internet game into the world that becomes real. And this was deeply influential in my thinking because Daniel Suarez, the author, did a hell of a good job predicting the future, including things like self-driving cars, way in advance of them hitting popular consciousness, drones, cryptocurrencies, AR, VR, the whole bit. So he was doing a very powerful example through pure narrative of what it is he was trying to explain in the story. And it was not lost on me that the framing of the game was quite helpful. And there's a gentleman named John Robb, who, if you track him down and kind of look at his context, Daniel Suarez, John Robb, and I had some really interesting conversations brought together by the book Damon. And even some of the early writings in Deep Code are actually just cut and paste of some of the stuff that we did. So that's one thread. The second thread was a lot of work that I had begun doing on the nature of money. This is in the context of the financial crisis. And so I was practically curious. And I was in a place, I think I've mentioned this before, and I think David, one of the Ripple Wisdom interviews, I was in a place, but most notably in this case, both the Santa Fe Institute and the Aspen Institute, and other places like the Perimeter Institute, to have conversations with people who knew a lot more and should have known a lot more. And so I got this really interesting capacity to have pretty quickly get a sense of what was the real state of the art in thinking about this particular most meaningful and at the time quite salient question, that it was shockingly incoherent. And then started looking at it myself, mostly reading 3 books. I think it was called The Origin of Wealth, which is a complexity approach to economics, a book by a kind of conservative British guy, something about money, Ian something maybe, and then Graeber's book, 5,000 Years of Debt, which is awesome. And this began the process of leading me down the rabbit hole. And I should say, by the way, it's just even background on that, an early dose of who I think is probably the highest bang for the buck, like most obscure and most useful philosopher, a guy named Manuel de Landa. I would guess that that's the name that is the most likely that nobody's heard of him when I say it, and would be the most valuable for literally everybody to have read.
Okay.
With those 2 curves, right? So de Landa, and the 2 books that were most specific here is The War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. It was his first book, and I think like 95. And the second one is 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. And he's a guy who innovated, or at least meaningfully innovated, something called assemblage theory, or that he calls assemblage theory. And anyone who is thinking about complexity, like complex system science, who hasn't fully metabolized de Landa has just got giant blanks in their mind. So I had done that. Like I had already done all that work through 1999 to 2007. So that was kind of in the background. So then I'm having this experience with Suarez. I'm having this experience with Graeber. And then my friend, Jim Rutt, who was at the time the chairman of the board of the Santa Fe Institute, and I just start having a dialogue, literally just like a coffee breaks between board meetings, where it becomes clear that we both had a very significant sense of there being something rotten in the state of Denmark, something corrupt in the nature of the society that we have to find ourselves in. And Jim is a very action-oriented individual, but he has sort of the most sort of doing energy, maybe the second most of anybody who I've ever met. And he's senior to me. I think if I'm 48, he's probably, gosh, he may be even pushing 70. Sorry, dude. If I'm aging you, I apologize, but he's kind of in that zone. And he did like his wave of entrepreneurship. And he's a high-tech entrepreneur, very successful high-tech entrepreneur. So his wave of entrepreneurship was exactly one shift before mine. Like when I was a kid working on BBSs. He was just an early entrepreneur creating BBS software, for example. And then he created, or was the CEO of the company that did DNS, right? Which was then the platform, the internet upon which I did my work. So as the consequence of our conversations, one of the things that showed up is he was the guy who presented this concept, which we later named the Jubilee, which, by the way, coincided so nicely with Graeber's own propositions, and began to conceptualize, well, what might we actually do? So if there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, what do we do about it? And Jim took the lead. So he took the lead, and his mental model was actually just through the lens of politics. Like, how could we actually do a political intervention with very high leverage, meaning not just policies that are sort of fun and nice, but actually policies that are very carefully designed from a complexity perspective to generate trophic cascades in the complex systems feedback loops of society, so that we actually did move things meaningfully. And if you think about that as the abstract intent, things begin to actually make more sense. So the artifact, or the way of embodying that intent, initially was a political party. Initially, I think it was called the New Day Party, and then it got rebranded as the Emancipation Party. I think you can still find the website if you Google it. And we spent a meaningful amount of time with a pretty good group of people thinking in the model or the frame of policies, and trying to create policies that were very thoughtful. And for example, we were proposing universal basic income way back then. This is probably 2011, 2012, 2010, somewhere in that time frame. And it proceeded forward, and there was some momentum. But as we continued to maneuver, we noticed two different things. One was that the form of political party, and in fact the form of politics in the domain of democracy, seemed very much not to be the right structure. A way of putting it is, millennials don't do politics. And so if you're designing something that is going to be ultimately landing on millennials and the people younger than them, and if they don't do politics, this was back in 2010, 2011, then politics, a political structure, is not the right approach. Certainly a new political party.
Well, it's not even just about that, though, is it? I mean, the very concept of party is exclusionary, right? I mean, it's
the whole thing
in the realm of rivalrousness, and this is one of the primary things to get away from, right?
Right. So in fact, this is the second piece. The second piece was, as people began to participate, who were people like Brett Weinstein, another gentleman named Sebastian Paquette, a number of folks who were oriented towards a more theoretical perspective. And the theoretical basis, as I said, we were trying to do things that were fundamental. And so we were constantly trying to figure out what would it mean to do something that was fundamental, which meant they were actually doing fundamental theory. And this is where Jim had actually specifically assigned me the responsibility of what he called deep code. Keep doing the fundamental theory until we have something we can actually use to build things on top of it. Those are, almost all the stuff that I've shared online was either figured out by me or discovered by me or shared with me by various people during this time frame, more or less. Mostly the third, mostly shared. And so the theoretical foundation began to actually point out a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, like the concepts of rivalrous and anti-rivalrous.
That came from
simply hadn't been part of the mindset until we were actually, shit, this is more fundamental. Complex and complicated weren't part of the mindset. So as the theoretical foundation began to kind of require a design, it became increasingly evident that the design of a political party was just the wrong tool. And there was an intermezzo where there was maybe it's the wrong tool, but maybe it's a transitionary useful tool. Like we can use it to create space to do the next thing. But then practically what it looked like, well, geez, more or less it won't land. Like the idea of a new political party just literally is not a real idea. Nobody will participate in it. Then even that argument went away. And this then gave birth to the concept of Game B. And so to say, Hall, as Green Hall at the time, if we're not going to be doing a political party, what is something that might work? So just start figuring that out. Just think about it. And we had these gatherings in Virginia. So it's like a city in Virginia called Staunton, Virginia. So Stanton 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so at Stanton 4, we actually had two really important presentations, one by Brett and one by myself. And Jim made the third, but the first two by Brett and myself were really the kernel of Game B. And you can imagine Brett, coming from his background, he was essentially describing how could we design something that would evolve towards the solution, right? Towards the thing that we're looking for. And then I came at it from this perspective of what is the meta design of that kind of thing, and how does it relate to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And I think actually both those presentations are still, exist somewhere in the digital memory. There may even be a video of me giving the presentation. And that was at Stanton 4, I want to say maybe 2012. And then Stanton 5 was a substantial expansion. So between the two, we had a huge amount of conversation, and a lot more people were beginning to be part of this project, like maybe 100-ish in that zone, maybe 70 in Basecamp. Remember, that was before Slack. And a lot of conversation, covering a lot of territory and trying to figure out how to do this work. And that led to then the naming of it is, well, I guess I named it Game B earlier, but beginning the real precision and articulation. And Stanton 5 was a real gathering that included folks like Bruce Kunkel, by the way, who I see a lot on the Facebook, and Benita Roy was at that gathering. Really trying to go deep, and a guy named Yasuhiko Kimura was there. Gosh, I hope I'm not creating a list of folks to kill. And if so, everything I just said is a very big lie, and none of those people were there. And I've never met them.
Sorry, can I just backtrack you just a little bit? Game A, you've characterized as a result of all of your research. Just correct me if I'm wrong. The basic characteristics of Game A, and hence Game B is the opposite of that, is complicated rather than complex, rivalrous, and top-down, broadcast in nature. Is that basically the core of it? Is that the essence of it?
Well, let me just fire off a bunch of other words, and we'll see if they reduce to those three. I mean, I think my basic sense is yes, but let's try some other ones. So, formal, but that could be identified as complicated. I think that's right.
And broadcast, better, actually, but yes.
Hierarchical. Right?
Yeah.
Again, we've got is reducible. The notion of money is fundamental, but that's still within the context of formal, which is still actually within the context of complicated. So, but it's not, I don't think it's necessary to try to do this in the most compact way. I think there's also some very real use of heuristically identifying that the creating an obligate bias in the direction of the complicated. Rivalrous at the heart, and specifically here, rivalrous, solving the problem of how do I outcompete other human bands at the heart.
But I mean, a huge part of that, as I've heard you say before, is scarcity, right? Whether real or perceived, but scarcity is right at the heart of rivalrousness as well, is it not? Because if there's plenty of everything, there's no need to compete for it, right?
Yeah, that's nice, because we can be very careful there. We can talk about the fact that there are, and I think I've talked about this in another context, there's like these two sort of overlapping continua. One continuum is the rivalrous continuum. So these are phenomena that, at least in principle, can be rivalrous, like the cellar that I just ate. Right? In principle, that can be rivalrous. And on the far, in my world, left side of that is true scarcity. Again, like this glass of water, this last swallow of water is in the domain of true scarcity. There we go, gone forever, and of no use to anyone besides my own metabolism. But on the far right-hand side of that continuum, we might call plenitude, where you got a whole lot of things that are fundamentally rivalrous, but you have so much of it, you don't necessarily care. So, the water in the oceans and the air in the sky, for the most part, right? But of course, the location on that continuum is a relationship between the presence of the phenomenon and the demand of the phenomenon, right? So if you add enough people into the equation who are breathing air, eventually all the air in the sky is no longer in plenitude, it's now in scarcity, right? So you can kind of snap back and forth. And then the other continuum, and by the way, we might put non-rivalrous is kind of in that term.
Yeah.
And then on the other continuum, we have the anti-rivalrous continuum. Right? So this is like the calculus or geometry or literally anything that lives in pure pattern, where on the far right-hand side, we have the fully unmediated potentia that is utterly unconsumed in its being held. When I tell you something, like right now, when I just tell you what I'm telling you, you're actually providing the resource, the scarce resource, which is your own neurology. And then the pattern is not scarce at all. So tagged all the way to the right. And we can tag even all the way to the right are those characteristics of the anti-rivalrous that are generative, meaning that when shared, their potency for producing more anti-rivalrousness is actually increased. So you've got like this whole, if you think about the logic of network effects, you can actually think about those things that are sort of all the way to the right of that. We can go down some real interesting, powerful detail because that science, the science of the anti-rivalrous, is kind of like Manuel de la Honda. It's sort of obviously the most important thing that you could really be thinking about if you care about being effective. And is the area that is very rarely thought about. So we could go there if you'd like. But on the left-hand side of the anti-rivalrous is those things that are media, are the mediation, the things that you need to use, the minimum viable mediation to be able to have an amount of anti-rivalrousness. So for example, your mind, your brain, right? There's only so much anti-rivalrous pattern that your neurology can actually hold. And so there is a real rivalry that is in relationship with the fundamentally anti-rivalrous, and you can move back and forth on that continuum, right? And then, by the way, just to be complete, we can take that those two continua, and those are both talking about the anti-rivalrous and the rivalrous from the point of view of phenomenology, like phenomena in world, objective, real things. We can also talk about those in terms of dispositions, or ways of behaving in relationship to real things, right? So I can have a rivalrous disposition, or I can have an anti-rivalrous disposition, or I can have a non-rivalrous disposition. And again, there are continua, and these things relate to each other. And so there's like this structure, which may be a 3x3, I don't really know, that talks about how the kind of the complex dynamics of where you find yourself and how you show up creates sort of the ways that these things will maneuver back and forth. A rivalrous disposition in the context of a non-rivalrous, a plenitude, will put you in a tragedy of the commons, which will eventually lead to actual scarcity, for example. A rivalrous disposition in the context of the anti-rivalrous will lead to trying to fence in the commons, create, for example, intellectual property, which will move something from the fundamentally anti-rivalrous into the simulated scarcity, for example. So you can do that kind of work. Okay, I think that's the end of that thread.
That was the grand vision of the Venus Project, wasn't it? That you created the ultimate anti-rivalrous domain globally, because everybody contributes not for what they can get, but to add to the commons, and everybody has access to the commons. And as the commons gets richer, everybody benefits from it and can contribute more because they're living in a healthier environment, and so on and so on and so on. And it spirals like this.
Fair enough, for sure.
I mean, I actually came to Rebel Wisdom and Game B and all of this via the Zeitgeist movement of the Venus Project. And Jacques Fresco talks in very, very similar terms. I actually hear you guys and him using much of the same language, but for him it was the monetary system which created the rivalrous. But I think the rivalrous, it's deeper than it underpins money, doesn't it? The rivalrous dynamic.
While I was not directly influenced by Jacques Fresco's ideas, I was bizarrely enough influenced by his aesthetics. Meaning that I had, at a very young age, come across images that had been produced by him, and they had connected with me in a way that was very compelling. And so many years later, I found myself doing a sort of weird search through what could have generated these images in my mind. Like, hey, I kept having these images pop up that aesthetically matched the sensibility of Game B. I was like, what are these things? I was like, okay, was it 70s? I kind of had a feeling of when it was I encountered it. It's like 70s science fiction. Fuck, what was this? And it turned out it was actually not entirely, but a decent amount of it was actually his stuff from a physical, like the way it looked. Yeah, I was never able to really get enough of a handle on what it is he was proposing in terms of the resource economy to feel like I got it. But at the aesthetic level, it totally landed. So then what happened is we had this sort of a burst of energy in Game B, building out a whole bunch of different ideas, most of which were very poorly articulated and poorly named, and roughly hewn. But it seemed like we go back and take a look at it. It's like, yeah, we had some very good stuff done then. And we decided at this point that Jim and I could no longer, no longer chose to fund it out of our own pocket. And it was time to go out and see if other people in the world were going to buy into this thing. And I think part of this was also Jim's instincts that how do you avoid becoming navel gazing? How do you avoid drinking your own Kool-Aid? Well, you have to periodically just go back out and see if anybody else is, somebody who's definitely not a Kool-Aid drinker, do they connect with what you're sharing? And this is where we discovered that, in fact, the answer was no. We did, I'd say, like 100 different conversations with people, many of whom really should have been able to get it. And sort of long story short, nobody did. And I can go into detail of exactly what we learned from that and what happened in that context. And in the meantime,
was that because you weren't articulating it as clearly as you do now, having thought it through better, or was just
well, I would say three things, roughly speaking, maybe four. One is we were not articulating it anywhere near as clearly as we are now. Maybe 10%, which, if you think about how unclear it is right now, that's rather impressive. Two was almost nobody was prepared to hear it at just a conceptual level. A lot has happened in the past 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, that has brought a lot of things into the conventional consciousness and into the minds that makes it much easier to bridge the gap. Three, the proposition that Game A was fragile, getting more fragile, and was inexorably self-terminating didn't seem viscerally realistic 7 years ago. Okay, the 2008 financial crisis, but we kind of solved that. We're all good. The green shoots in the new normal. Happy times are here again. Actually, I remember a Google guy saying that. And of course, most of the people who were speaking with had some vested interest in that not being the case. We were talking to people who, at least in principle, could fund something, so they had won Game A to some level. Or if they couldn't fund it, they were at least able to be. They had legitimacy. They were winners in Game A in some fashion. And then the fourth was something along the lines of, kind of because of the third, people hadn't gone through the grieving process. And so what would happen is often I'd actually just see that somebody would get it, they'd sense it, they realize it, but then immediately shut down and not absorb it because, it's a tough thing to chew on.
Big and scary, absolutely.
Yeah, it's big and scary. And so that was that. And so, and by the way, so on the one hand, the outward facing, this isn't landing. And on the other hand, on the inward facing, as I think Jim talked about in a podcast, there was a schism on the inside the group between those people who were coming from a perspective of work on the interior and people who are coming from the perspective of work on the exterior. So, and there's a little bit of a generation gap here too. My sense is that the boomers have a bad mapping. They were kind of burned by the failure of the consciousness experiment in the 60s and 70s. And they have, they're like little petulant toddlers. Just because they fucked it up means it's impossible. And I would say, I'm saying that kind of mean. Okay? And we could definitely say they fucked it up. But on the other hand, just because it didn't work then means it's impossible. I think it's reasonable to say that lots of good stuff happened then. Lots of bad stuff happened, but lots of good stuff. And these sorts of things are hard. So we had a kind of a visceral response on the part of exterior-oriented boomers who were like not at all interested in any kind of consciousness-raising talk, even language that talked about the fact that people have an interior at all. And then a cohort of people who are just coming from that land. And so they're more, and there's a a bias in that direction too, a bias towards, hey, let's not worry about institutions. We just need to get everybody's consciousness raised, which I think is also not reasonable. And so that schism was happening, and I noticed that it decohered the system pretty quickly, actually. It's like, okay, that's interesting too. That while we had a brief moment, like a little summer of love for like not even a year, like 6 months, where there's like, wow, a lot of creative activity, a lot of people pouring energy in, its ability to decohere around somewhat who cares, like irrelevant or bad distinctions, was also quite notable. And so Jim and I agreed, and by the way, not with an effort at consensus. Both of us just said, hey, my energy to push this thing forward is no longer enough. We said, okay, let's move this into spore mode. Let's see what happens if we just sort of, each individual who's been part of it takes what they take and goes out, and we kind of go out and try to carry the ethos and the aesthetics and the sensibility out into the world. What happens? And that's what happened. So call it 2013-ish. Maybe I'm off on the dates, by the way. I don't claim anything vaguely like chronological precision. It definitely wasn't 1920, and it definitely wasn't 2300. Somewhere between those two. Sport mode kicked in, and I went off. And by the way, Vanessa, who was part of it as well, went off on our journey. And everybody else kind of did their thing. And it's interesting. Like, if you track the people in their journeys, they've been interesting. Very interesting journeys that each of the individuals, or many of the individuals, have taken in that time frame. Brett, for example, has had a meaningful move from a painfully obscure evolutionary theorist at a painfully obscure left-leaning college to somebody who's schooling Richard Dawkins. And I think finally, at long last, the possibility of him actually expressing the more fundamental concepts that he's been holding now for 2 decades seems to be becoming right. And it'll be great, because it's like major upgrades are possible right now in his discipline, and he has them. So him sharing them would be, I think, quite useful.
What brought you sort of out into the open again onto Rebel Wisdom, and you making your own videos on your own channel? What sort of brought you back into mushroom mode?
Well, this is actually not a trivial question to answer, because now we're asking questions like causation. How does anything happen? And to answer the question, I think what occurred to me, this is, now we get to a bit self-referential. One of the things that happened in the context of my journey in spore mode was a nearly reckless commitment to renovation, diving in to the possibilities of growth, possibilities of change.
Do you mean personally?
Yeah, personally.
Yeah.
With some pretty intensely, with a lot of commitment, let's say, and it's almost like as a question, as an inquiry. It's like, what's possible in this direction? Like, coming largely from a background that would have said interior is medium interest, exterior is most of the heavy lifting lives, but actually finding myself very aware of the meaningfulness of what was being said by the folks who were speaking about the interior. I said, okay, I'll just do it. Fuck it. I'll dive in. I'll see what happens.
Sorry, just backtracking again a little bit. I'm curious about one thing. Do you think you were drawn to the intense inner work that you were drawn to as a consequence of the schism that appeared in Game B between the inner and the
for sure.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, there were 3 things going on. One was my own outer life was falling apart. So I ended up having a divorce and lots of other sort of fallout. So I was painfully aware of the fact that who I was, how I was showing up in the world, was not working. So there's something about the interior that either this whole thing is just a shit show and we should all kill ourselves, or you can't actually change something about yourself and you can actually live a life that feels meaningful and at least pleasant. So that's one part. And that's super intense, right? And that was happening in this same time frame. For a long time it had been happening, but it was kind of becoming increasingly intense. So the second is that now I'm in this context where, by the way, the ability to turn away from that was becoming increasingly dishonorable. In the context of what we're doing in Game B, it was not just my happy home. It was to the degree to which I'm playing a role or trying to participate in something that may actually be much larger than myself, I'm not just dishonoring my own life and my family. I'm also dishonoring whatever this might be. And that was another heavy thing. And then actually beginning to encounter people who were connecting with me at a very human level, and was awakening in me the recognition that, you know, small shifts in relationality can actually make huge differences in who you are, which can make huge differences in how you show up, which then make huge differences in what you actually end up bringing into the world. So all those were coming in at the same time. And then a heavy dose of that was then Vanessa coming in with a very similar arc. And she also ended up having a divorce in more or less the same time frame. And she came in with a huge amount of self-change that wanted and needed to happen. And so our relationship was like on that, like a co-evolutionary commitment of, let's, you know, put all the chips in and see what happens.
That must be awesome. That must be a great foundation for a relationship, right? You really get to know each other well quickly, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite eye-opening, actually, just to do the delta between how much you really can get to know someone and how much you can get to know yourself. And even just like the simple insight that until you truly have learned how to love yourself, you cannot love someone else. Like until you actually have that hit, like, whoa. And of course, once you do get that hit and you realize the difference between that and I guess you would call it narcissism, which is the simulation of that. You know, those are all things that come when you hit the temperature level is high enough, things melt. Getting the temperature high enough, boom, the crucible opens, and then real things come out of it. Yeah. And one of the things that happened as a consequence of that journey was a building up of a particular capacity of how to sense what is the choice that is the most effective in the moment. You might call it applied intuition or something like that. I think recently I've been calling it flowing in hypercomplexity, or flexing the muscles of hypercomplexity. I think I mentioned that in a conversation with Guy Senstock a few days ago. And so I would say that, like that capacity, that sense of how to sense what is being called for in the moment on the basis of what it is that I'm perceiving, you know, the whole perception that I have, and the basis of how my relevance realization system identifies that. So the answer to the question is, it may not be satisfying because it's sort of generally true to every possible version of that question. But I could just say like the local reality. I'll give you an example. I hadn't written anything publicly. And Vanessa said, why don't you write something publicly? And I think I initially like took a couple of the articles that I had written and shared them on a group called Deviant Art, because my friend Angelo is the guy who created Deviant Art. And I noticed both. There was some interesting conversation. There was also a lot of not interesting conversation, so I wasn't super motivated. And then another buddy of mine, a guy named GK, more or less at the same time nudged me as well. And there was something about the synchrony of the timing. Like there was no obvious background behind both of them. And the way that they show up is very different. He was a friend of mine from fourth grade. And by a collaborator in a bunch of different initiatives I've done in my adult life. And, you know, she's my life partner. And they both, the way they kind of nudged me, kicked me into an energy level of endeavoring to actually write something for the purposes of being received by the public. But very experimental. I can tell you, I was very, let's call it truculent in stepping into that. Like I had no, the opposite of desire to actually be successful. Well, sorry, to be popular is a better way of putting it. Yeah. If 4 or 5 people read it and felt like it was useful, I would consider that success. And if 1 million people read it and it just made, and they completely, it made them less effective, or they actually took it the wrong way, then that would be terrible. And so here's the case then of that sense of feeling. Like, how do you actually follow the quality of rightness and noticing? And I think that if you actually take a look at my writings, and by the way, even if you just take a look at like literally who I am, my participatory knowing, how I am showing up in the world, because now there's enough of a trace of that you can actually witness it publicly. The feeling of when a particular mode of expression created possibilities of relationality, meaning people responded in a way that had an increasing feeling of rightness in the way that they responded, oriented me more towards how to hone and shift my own who I was so that I could continue to express more in a way that increased the quality of the way that it landed, which increased the quality of the way that they responded and who they were and their own participatory knowing. And this then becomes a coevolutionary dance. And you get this sort of triadic movement where there's my discernment increases my capacity, which then increases my expression, which then to some extent, to the degree which my quality of expression is solid, increases the capacity in the other, which then generates in them a response, which then my discernment can signal to noise differentiate it in some way, which increases my discernment because I now have a differential between input and output. My discernment is like, oh, okay, it gets better, which then creates a loop. And notice the coordination there between what you were saying earlier with the Venus project.
Oh, what, the self-reinforcing feedback loop into the commons and out again sort of thing. Yeah.
And there's a mapping. It's actually a mapping. So the Venus project is talking about it in the context of energy. And here we're talking about it in the context of, say, pattern or discernment, communication. There's a mapping. They're identical. They're the same topology. And then something like Rebel Wisdom shows up. Like, I didn't go out to David. I didn't even know who he was at all. He reached out to me. I can't even remember exactly what the context was. Maybe it was an email. And said, hey, can we chat? Or would it be interesting for us to chat? Here's something that I'm in. And here's what I did. I meditated. I meditate every day. And in the context of my meditation, I just sort of brought in the possibility of that and felt, did it feel like was there a rightness to it? Did it feel like there was a rightness to it? And was there any boundary conditions? Like, did some part of myself hold back? Was some part of me like, not really? Could I say with like a wholeness of self? Could I say yes to this possibility with a wholeness of self? And what's interesting about this is that it's not magic. Like, I didn't actually know he was going to record the damn thing. I didn't know that he was making a documentary. I didn't know he was a documentarian. I didn't know that he was going to take me, like, I don't know, sitting out on my front stoop with my laptop, wearing my bathrobe, spewing whatever nonsense happened to come out of my face at the moment, and append it to the beginning of a documentary that he was making about Jordan Peterson. I thought we were just having a conversation. So it's not like I knew that it was a good idea. But what I can say is that my wisdom, the degree to which I had the degree to which I had good perception, which in this case was clearly wanting, and the degree to which I had built good instincts, definitely left me to a wholeness of self saying yes. I mean, no part of me, given what I knew, was saying no. And some part of me probably should have asked better questions, right? So that's a learning. Like, maybe I asked better questions. But net, it seems like it kind of worked out. So maybe I'm okay with that. And I noticed the part of me that would ask better questions still hasn't grown any, we call it strength in the larger society of selves. So and this conversation is to that point. Exactly. Like you've actually, I think, mentioned many times. And I imagine this is actually something having to do with your own interior and your sense of self. But, why am I having this conversation with you?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not because you've got thousands of or millions of viewers. So here's some things, because I think the question you're asking actually brought us here, brings out some stuff that I think might prove useful. So one of the things that I noticed when you contacted me was something about it's weird. It's like the quality of the language. You can tell the difference. I think this is not even slightly ambiguous. You can tell the difference between a marketer and somebody who is actually communicating with you. You can feel it. You can absolutely feel it. Like the consciousness that is behind something is evident in the something. It bleeds between the letters and between the lines.
Yeah.
And so when you, I think, wrote to me, I'm pretty sure you wrote, I could feel that the consciousness that was expressing itself through those words to me was a consciousness that was, well, at the very least, worth taking the risk of communicating with a little more, right? And then in every interaction that I had with your consciousness, mediated by the various expressions that you have. I think I watched one video that you did. Maybe I didn't even do that. I can't quite remember.
I contacted you to say I've used some of your ideas in a video. If you want to take a look at it and tell me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I did. And as I listened to it, what I felt was integrity. And what I mean by integrity, what I mean is that the things that I had shared, that you were now sharing back, had maintained their truth. To the degree that I was expressing truth at all, you were not diluting, but were in fact reinforcing and increasing that truth. For me, that's it. Like, at that point, I'm done. I will definitely support that in world. And anybody who can do that, to the degree that I have the resources to do so, I only have so many minutes in the day, I would support that. And so then it's a yes. The whole of self actually left it to a yes. So for me, this has not been a question of like begrudging. It's more been a question of, I don't really know what's happening here. I don't have a good sort of raison for why we would have this conversation, but I know that it's a good idea.
Okay.
Good enough for me.
Fair enough. Good. No, that's good enough for me. Excuse me. Good enough for me too. I mean, I've noticed you've done quite a few broadcasts of one kind or another, podcasts or YouTube interviews with, like me, people who have very, very small audiences. So yeah, I mean, it's just more spores. You're spreading more spores around, aren't you? Your mushroom is spreading more spores around, I guess. Plants.
Something like that. Yeah. It's what's the right thing to do? I mean, to me, it's as simple as that. Like, I'm not trying to plan anything. Well, I am planning some things, but certainly in this domain, I'm not planning anything. And I'm just trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. I'm just trying to always go in that direction of what is the right choice. And that's not easy. The most recent example is that when Guy and I were talking, he asked to record it. I said, sure. And during most of the time frame that we were talking, it was very much an intimate person-to-person conversation.
It was very intimate. Yeah.
And the feeling, like the container was a container that was just an intimate person-to-person conversation. And but as we got to the end, I had a distinct feeling of, well, shit. That's a lot. There's a lot of stuff in there that is, let's call it messy, or what unattractive might be another term. So part of me feels, with that being out there. But on the other hand, if he earnestly felt in his wisdom, from his perspective, that it was worth and reasonable to share, that I would support that. And so, of course, I specifically said that near the end. And then he did. And I don't know how many people have watched it. It may only be like 9 people. But the point is, it's out there, right? And so that's this is a tightrope walk. This is a thing where it's like parenting a child, where you're definitely fucking it up all the time, and hopefully also you're getting it right all the time. And your job is just to try to figure out how to continue to sort of get better as it gets hard, move forward, so that you're ahead of the curve and you're constantly like on some up gradient. Yeah.
What I liked about that conversation, I didn't watch all of it. I watched about half an hour, 40 minutes of it, something like that. It's only been up a couple of days. I just stumbled across it yesterday. What I like about it, not the content so much, but what I like about it was the very obvious and deliberate effort that both of you were making to recognize fully the other and what they were saying and what they were feeling, and vocalizing what your emotional response was and how that then leads to a more sort of intellectual response. And so even though the content of what you said was, I must admit, I can't remember a single thing that you said in terms of what you said, but I remember very clearly the feeling of the exchange. And I think, even though, as you say, in places it feels a bit, I don't know, awkward, clumsy, embarrassing, whatever, but I think that modality is really important. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about Rule Omega, and tell me what you think of this, because I've been sort of phrasing this for a while. So tell me what you think of this. That Rule Omega is one of the, or perhaps the generator function, which, if installed and run at sufficient nodes in the network, would bring about the playing of game B.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that you said it was just right.
Yeah, so I think that modality of communication, even though it's, to me personally, and this is my thing, I completely get that. To me personally, it feels a little bit overly touchy-feely, new agey, kind of creepy sometimes. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But I get that discomfort is entirely my internal thing. I do get that. So I mean, I've got a lot of work to do in that area. But yeah, but I do. It's absolutely crucial. So yeah, even if you don't feel great about it, I think it's important stuff. That kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I think you're the way. I think you said it just right. Everything I quite liked. I had a strong positive feeling as you were talking, and actually several distinct strong positive feelings. And I think that this distinction made between the content and maybe the form or the wayness. I think you nailed it exactly. Like the thing that we talked about may have been particularly meaningful to us, and it may not be meaningful to anybody else. But in particular, the way the guy was doing what he was doing, and I was quite touched by it. Like, wow, holy cow! At a masterful level, as far as in my own personal experience, he was doing that thing, like really allowing the space of the conversation to be like perceiving the things that it needed to perceive to allow it to actually continue to open and deepen and become more and more rich. And that I think has actually been a stronger characteristic of Rule Omega. You know, it's like, I swear to be a good dance partner, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. So that was actually specifically it that I was hoping would land if he decided to share it. Like, I don't know that I or he said anything that was specifically at a content level needing to be shared, but more being able to do the thing he was doing,
Yeah.
and that, you know, I would like to do at that level, would be great. Really good.
Yeah, it's something I struggle to find willing practice partners for. There's a few of us on the Discord channel who have started to get together on a reasonably regular basis and try and have discussions, again, content unimportant, but using this modality of, you know, really being open and putting your own agendas and your own paradigms insofar as you can do to one side, and really try and enter into the other shoes. As I say, I've got a lot of work to do. Yeah, I mean, I wish I'd come across this stuff 20, 30 years ago, you know, because
Yeah.
I feel like it's a really important time, and this sounds impossibly pompous, but I feel like I've got something inside me which this moment is, you know what I mean? I'm matched to this particular moment in history. I feel I've got something to contribute to it. I have no idea what it is, but I know I've got a lot of work to do before I'm able to effectively contribute. I think at the moment I'm more of a hindrance than anything else.
Well, let me suggest something that just came up as you were saying that, because I've come across this a number of times with the poor recipients of the British culture. And the phrase, "this sounds impossibly pompous," which I suppose there's meaningful value to that perspective as well, for sure. I would go the opposite direction, which is to say that I would drink of humility until there is no more to be drunk. And if you find yourself coming with an absolute, like, gobsmacked perspective of comprehensive humility, then I think a lot of the things that you're talking about will find themselves more easily brought into the world. You know, it's not having like an adequate level of pomposity to actually share what you think is yours to share, but the opposite. Not to have the self-doubt or self-limiting narrative that prevents you from sharing it, but the truth of humility. The truth that you are only a vessel, and you're here really just to do the work of making it possible for that which wants to express itself through you to be truly heard. And you have nothing to do with it. So get the fuck out of the way and let that come through. That's what you're here for. That's maybe a way of getting through that.
Yeah, I get that. It's not necessarily easy to recognize that which is coming through from that which is your own stuff. But yes.
That's right. That's a skill. That's real. And if you can
yeah.
get there, then it hits nicely. That's a powerful thing to be able to share too.
Yeah. I'd be really delighted to do another one of these if you're up for it.
Yeah, sounds nice. Let's do it. Well, the pace is probably going to slow down a bit because I've got some other things coming onto my calendar.
Like I said, my expectations are low, so whenever you can.
All right, man.
Thanks very much. Pleasure. Cheers. Bye-bye.